Hi, I'm Brent Stafford, and this is RegWatch by RegulatorWatch.com. Is there a link between the science of vaping and that of climate change? I know, the question sounds preposterous, but wait, if you're a vapor, you know all too well that back in 2015, if the science was settled on vaping as it's claimed to be on climate change, then it's likely vaping would already be banned almost everywhere. Vaping became demonized in the public mind thanks to a barrage of misleading science published in peer-reviewed journals, then promulgated by the mainstream media. The research fueled an onslaught of negative news headlines, such as vaping is as bad as smoking, could lead to cocaine use, or even kill in one puff. With millions dying each year from smoking-related diseases, you would expect the science on vaping to be evidence-based. Instead, much of it is proven to be junk. If scientific claims could prove untrustworthy in an area so important to public health, why shouldn't the public be skeptical about other scientific claims, such as those regarding global warming and the theory of man-made catastrophic climate change? Hysteria over vaping rings from the same bell as global warming, for which climate activists first mastered the battle tactics now familiar to so many vapors. Those tactics include a deluge of one-sided scientific research exclaiming disastrous impacts predicted for long into the future, a stranglehold on research funding to the tune of tens of millions of dollars for anti-vaping research and billions of dollars for research to support climate change. For those scientists that do find funding and bravely counter the party line, well, they face withering attack on the legitimacy of their research and professional integrity. Most are called skeptics or deniers, despite the fact that doubt is the starting point of all genuine scientific inquiry. There are two operating principles at work here, which are hostile to sound science, yet power the anti-vaping and pro-climate change movements. The first is a Machiavellian precept: the end justifies the means. That is, a virtuous outcome excuses any wrongs committed to attain it. For climate change, almost every policy and action is justified by this precept, including the deliberate manipulation of climate science and the unrelenting propaganda spewed from the mainstream media. Skewed science and biased media is of no surprise to vapors, which have the climate change movement to thank for breaking down the firewalls protecting journalism and scientific integrity. Specifically to vaping, the end justifies the means provides the support to ban flavors. While the goal to protect the kids is righteous, it's also indifferent to the outcome, which puts the immediate health of adult vapors at risk. The second operating principle at work is called the precautionary principle. It was born from the environmental movement and codified in direct partnership with public health at the Wing Spread Conference in 1998, held in the state of Wisconsin. It's now law in the European Union and lies at the heart of every international agreement on climate change. The precautionary principle states, when an activity raises threats of harm to human health or the environment, precautionary measures should be taken, even if some cause and effect relationships are not fully established scientifically. This means a policy may be enacted to prohibit or restrict an activity, even if there is no scientific proof it causes harm. The only prerequisite is scientific uncertainty and a suspicion of risk. Precautionary principle is really the smoking gun that links the tactics of the climate change movement with those of the anti-vaping movement. How often have vapors heard, "We just don't know enough about the risks of vaping, therefore to be safe than sorry, let's enact regulations to hinder or even ban vaping altogether"? You've got to give credit where credit is due. Activists insist on the one hand that the science is settled on climate change, yet on the other, they insist scientific proof of cause and effect isn't necessary, thanks to the precautionary principle. They've really boxed civilization in from both ends, and if this sounds a little political, well, that's because it is.
When I read the American Lung Association official call an electronic cigarette tobacco, that is a smoking gun of where the left, in the guise of science, American Lung Association, what could be more prestigious? He simply lies. There is nothing about an electronic cigarette that has anything to do with tobacco, but he calls it a tobacco product in this letter to the New York Times. So my assumption is, since they lie on behalf of their causes under the facade of science, why would the whole hysteria over global warming be any different? They're all of a sudden being honest.
Joining us today to unpack some of the science around climate change is Dr. Roy Spencer. Dr. Spencer is an award-winning meteorologist, principal research scientist, author, and expert witness to Congress on climate change science.
When we take into account how much the deep oceans have warmed since the 1950s, and take into account the effect of El Niños and La Niñas, and increasing carbon dioxide, and all of the other forcing mechanisms that the IPCC uses in their climate model runs, we find that the climate system is relatively insensitive.
Dr. Spencer served 15 years at NASA. While there, as senior scientist for climate studies, he co-developed the original method for precise monitoring of global temperatures from Earth-orbiting satellites. Currently, he also serves as the U.S. science team leader for the Advanced Microwave Scanning Radiometer, a critical part in NASA's Earth observing system, which is flying right now on NASA's Aqua satellite, where it monitors global sea surface temperatures.
Some of the statistics that have been given today, I think, are only giving half the story. For instance, Jennifer Francis has talked about the decrease in the Arctic sea ice. And I know something about that because I'm the lead scientist on NASA's best instrument for monitoring that decrease in Arctic sea ice. But what she didn't mention is that Antarctic sea ice, over that same 30-year period that we've been monitoring, has been increasing. So there's a lot of half-truths in this business. You can point to some areas that are changing, some areas that are changing in one direction, some are changing in another direction. At some point, we have to ask ourselves, is all of this just mostly part of what the climate system does naturally?
Dr. Spencer, thanks for joining us today on RegWatch. Let me ask you first, for those of our viewers who adamantly believe climate change is real and poses a threat, what's the most important thing they need to know about you and the science on global warming?
Well, I think the biggest misconception about the whole global warming issue is that there's only two sides, that either it's a big hoax or it's real and it's going to be catastrophic. I'm considered a lukewarmer in that I believe, based on the science, that there is some warming that should be happening, and we're probably seeing some of that, but I believe that it's fairly benign and that the extra CO2 is actually probably good for life on Earth. You know, I've been studying this for decades, and I'm pretty convinced that that it's sort of a non-problem.
Not a problem. Dr. Spencer, that must be a challenging point to communicate to some people.
Well, yeah. And, you know, I try to remind people that the theory of global warming by itself isn't ridiculous. That there is some theoretical expectation that if you add CO2 to the atmosphere, it's going to cause some amount of warming. I can argue that from a theoretical standpoint, but I can't prove it observationally. There's no way to do it. There is no fingerprint of human-caused climate change in the long-term warming trend.
Dr. Spencer, that statement contradicts so much of what we hear in the media all the time, that the science supporting global warming is settled.
Well, there's a fundamental problem with collecting global temperature data and interpreting it in terms of climate change. The signal that we're looking for climate change is very small. The consensus of opinion, you know, the people that believe that we're in trouble on climate change, they're looking at only maybe 2, at most 0.03 of a degree C per year warming, which is, you know, 0.2 to 0.25 of a degree C per decade. Okay, that's a really small signal, because from one year to the next, we can see 1 degree, you know, from one year to the next, whether there's an El Nino or a La Nina going on. So we have all of this natural noise in the system caused by the climate system doing what it does naturally. And we're trying to pick out this long-term weak warming trend. None of our temperature measurement systems were meant to reliably pick that up. The important thing is, no matter how you analyze the data, the warming trends that we're getting from any of the observations is only about half of what the climate models are predicting, okay? In fact, it's not even what the climate models are predicting. It's hindcasts. It's what the climate models have claimed should have happened in the last, let's say, 30, 40, 50 years. They can't even get the answer right when they know what the answer is.
Dr. Spencer, did I hear that correctly? The climate models being used to predict future global warming can't even predict what's already happened in the past?
Right, yeah, which is amazing. I mean, how does that happen? You would say, well, why don't they just adjust the models to reproduce what's happened in the past? And I think the answer is because it makes the global warming problem look less. And they can't have that because, I mean, as someone who used to work in government, like I did, and I used to go to Washington, D.C. routinely to help NASA sell its programs to Congress, if there isn't a problem to study, you don't get money, So it's not just all of the money tied up in the politics of the policies, the energy policies, it's also the scientists. I mean, the scientists are basically, we've got a bunch of people like myself whose careers have been built on the fear of global warming. And that fear is what you need in order to get funding. And no matter what people claim, scientists are just as biased as everybody else, especially in this field where causation is so hard to pin down. By causation, I mean, is it nature? Is it mankind? Is it some combination of the two? When causation is uncertain, you can pay a scientist to say, oh, well, okay, I'll side with that explanation because I get more funding that way.
Dr. Spencer, do you think climate politics have poisoned science?
Yes, it has. It has.
How do you think that happened?
Scientists are partly to blame for allowing this whole thing to get that far. 20 years ago, when Al Gore started making this his signature issue in the late 1980s, scientists basically allowed him to exaggerate what science knew because scientists knew, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, that we would get more funding as a result anyway. And now we've reached the point where everyone is convinced that, global warming is a disaster, just waiting to happen, and that it's a foregone conclusion. And that's just not the case. It never was the case. But, our side of the argument, the lukewarmer side, the skeptic side, if you want to call it skeptics, doesn't make good news. I mean, we don't bleed, so we don't lead.
You mentioned the news media, Dr. Spencer. Considering that the mainstream media is openly hostile to sound science, how do you reach people who vehemently believe that climate change poses a real threat to the human species?
If they vehemently believe it, you cannot reach them.
Really?
Yeah, well, this is a matter of faith. Okay, it has to do with people's beliefs about the role of government in their lives, their worldview, even their religious views. I've had people tell me that they would feel uncomfortable to think that we were at the mercy of Mother Nature and that we weren't the ones in control of the climate system. So, how do you argue with people who basically have such strong religious beliefs or a need to believe that humans are in control of the climate system?
Dr. Spencer, final question, actually more of an observation. Climate science appears to be the only science that I know of to require a sacrifice in order to abide by its tenets. It demands humanity to sacrifice the key energy source powering its civilization, even though no viable alternative exists yet. It doesn't seem rational.
There is no way to substantially reduce carbon dioxide emissions without killing millions of people. Humanity requires abundant, affordable energy. No matter what you believe about increasing solar and wind power in the coming, let's say, 20 years, we are never going to get to more than about 20% of global energy demand being met by renewable energy. It's still mostly going to come from fossil fuels. There is no practical solution other than to kill off humanity, because if there's one thing we know is a threat to human health and prosperity, it's poverty. Poverty kills. Worldwide, century after century, poverty kills. And if you take away abundant, affordable energy from poor people around the world, like the billion people who still don't have electricity. So this is why I speak out, is because for me, it's a moral issue.
Well, that's it for this edition of RegWatch. Before you head off, please like us on Facebook and don't forget to follow us on Twitter. For RegulatorWatch.com, I'm Brent Stafford.